Console sales figures are always a hot topic, so let's talk about console sales figures in 2022. When it comes to comparing consoles, one of the primary stats that everyone loves to talk about are console sales figures. While this generation, things are a little bit more murky, and we'll talk about that more here in a minute, console sales figures always reign supreme, and Sony loves to talk about how many consoles they have sold, and Microsoft, well, not so much. Microsoft says, please judge us by a different figure, and that figure is Game Pass subscriptions, not console sales, but on this video, we're going to be talking about console sales figures. Now, there's a little bit of, we got to be reading through the tea leaves because neither company is giving us a direct comparison head to head, but we do have some data. So later in 2021, Sony talked about how many consoles they had sold on the PlayStation 5 side, and it was around 13.5 million, but that was earlier in the year, and so not really where we are today. But doing some math and some extrapolating, I think it's likely fair to say the PlayStation 5 has somewhere sold between 17 and 20 million. Somewhere between that figure is probably about right. My gut says maybe closer to the 18 figure, but we'll find out here because Sony does tell us actually how many consoles have moved off the assembly lines and out into the warehouses in the world. Now, on the Microsoft side, they don't tell us, and I honestly do not expect them to tell us for maybe potentially ever, just because they said judge us on Game Pass numbers, not on console sales numbers, and so it's a little murky in the details there. But our good buddy and analyst Daniel, which you probably recognize him on the Twitters, said, hey look, according to our data, they're at 12 million consoles moved, and so that gives us at least a starting point, even if it's not exactly accurate, and we're fudging some numbers to try to understand truly where it is. But one data point that I do want to toss out there that has been relatively accepted as pretty close to the truth is that last generation console sales were roughly 2-to-1, meaning every time Microsoft sold one Xbox, there were two PlayStations sold or PlayStation 4s were sold for that generation. It was 2-to-1, meaning 50%. And time again, I've talked about if Microsoft was able to close that gap in console sales, then they have already sort of won this generation because they've shrunk the gap. Doing some math here related to the consoles, if Microsoft is truly at 12, and Sony's somewhere between 17 and 20, it looks like Microsoft is matching Sony sales roughly in the 60 to maybe 70% range. Maybe even a little bit higher, 75%, depending on where the numbers truly fall, which is notably higher than the 50% that Microsoft did last generation. So overall, that's actually a pretty good thing for Microsoft that they're keeping it closer than they had in previous years. So that's a good sign for Microsoft. Now, there is a massive caveat to all that, and that is the chip shortages. The chip shortages are definitely playing into this. They're impacting both companies, and we don't know which one is more disproportionately impacted than the other. Very likely could be that PlayStation is having more trouble than Xbox, but we don't actually know. And so these numbers have a little bit of fog, if you will, around them, because it could be that Sony would be further ahead if they could have got more product on the shelf, or it could be that Microsoft is closing the gap even more if they could have had more product on the shelf. Those things really are definitely playing into it and are definitely a caveat that must be respected and understood. Now, keep in mind that Microsoft has really made a very strong and conceited effort that their content is not only available on the console that sits underneath your TV. Think of things like Forza Horizon 5 and Halo Infinite launching same day, same place, same time. Well, not same place, but on the PC as well. Microsoft is very much going for, hey, we want to sell games. It doesn't matter where, if it's on the console or on the PC. Microsoft owns the PC platform with Windows. They don't care. You're still playing on Windows. So that really does, again, effectively work against console sales because you didn't have to buy a console to play Halo. You could just play it on your PC, which the net result is probably better for Microsoft because they probably are going to make a lot more money attracting gamers to Halo Infinite on a PC than convincing gamers on a PC to go buy a $500 box to put under their TV. So the long-term effect is probably better for Microsoft, but it definitely can play into the actual consoles that are sold. Also, keep in mind that Microsoft's narrative has really been around Game Pass. That is where they want everybody to be going, and they, again, don't care where you're playing it. But then there's also things like cloud gaming, which really ties into that too. Now, I will be the first to say that I don't really think that somebody did not buy a console because they were able to play Halo Infinite on their phone. I still think that cloud gaming, for its most part, is a nice benefit. It's not the main attraction of Xbox right now. So I don't don't really buy a narrative, at least yet, that Microsoft didn't sell as many consoles because you could play Halo Infinite. You don't even need a console directly on your phone. It's a good experience, but it is far and away from a native experience. So that is not quite there yet. Now, there are other things coming online this year we know of, things like being able to stream Xbox stuff directly on your TV. Microsoft has already said they're working with manufacturers. They're also going to have the streaming boxes coming out. It'll be interesting to see where those streaming boxes fall. Are those technically console sales? Well, they could be considered consoles, but it's not like a console like we typically think of it. And so interesting things just to keep in mind. Now, Phil Spencer recently did an interview with the New York Times' Kara Swisher, where he talked about a lot of different things, including Xbox Live and sales and whatnot. And he kept saying, and Microsoft has said this multiple times, that their generational sales at this point are way ahead of previous generations, meaning the Xbox Series X and S are selling or outperforming the Xbox One during its launch. Now, let's just be honest for a second. That's probably not too hard to beat at that point, because remember, it launched with the Kinect. It launched with a higher price point. It had a lot of negative press around the Xbox One's release, and so that's maybe not such a great, high watermark for judging how well Xbox is doing. And keep in mind, the thing that always sort of perturbs me a little bit about this is that Microsoft says, hey, judge us on our Game Pass numbers, which they have not released. They haven't released them at all, really, at least in 2022. We know that because the year's not that old, but they haven't released them in several quarters. And so if Microsoft does not talk about their Game Pass numbers on January 25th, which is the next time their earnings drop, that'll be a little awkward. But Microsoft says, judge us on our Game Pass numbers. They won't give us those, and then they come out and say, look how well the consoles are selling, but won't give us those either. So Microsoft's really got to clean up its messaging here, at least be a little bit more transparent. Maybe not clean it up, might be the wrong way to phrase it, but definitely understanding that Microsoft says great things are happening, but they're not giving us a lot of tangible and actionable items that really express that things are selling. We all kind of believe it, and I don't think that these consoles are selling poorly. We saw how hard it has been to get your hands on a Series X. I still get notifications all the time. It's like, consoles available for sale, and like people rush and buy them, and then you can't get your hands on them. So the consoles are definitely selling. Like, that's not the conversation. It's Microsoft, if you want us to judge you on Game Pass numbers, talk about how well Game Pass is doing, not how well consoles are selling, or give us console sales numbers, because we need to better understanding about how well Microsoft actually is doing. That being said, they're not really, considering how large Microsoft is in multiple, like tens of billions of dollars each quarter, like $30 billion plus, actually I think it was more than that the past couple quarters. Either way, the amount of revenue that is brought in through the gaming channel, while significant, is definitely not material to the overall org, especially when it comes to console sales. Now, the overall org could be material, but the individual line items of console sales may not be material, which is another thing, especially given the fact that it's primarily believed that these consoles are sold basically break even, maybe a small loss or maybe a small profit, but it's not driving a lot of net income at the end of the day out of these things. Either way, interesting stuff to know that based on the information we have right now, it does look like Microsoft is closing that gap from what they did with the Xbox One, which is very good for Microsoft, considering they got a lot of positive momentum out of the second half of the year, especially that last quarter with Halo Infinite and Forza Horizon and Age 4 all dropping into Game Pass. That is a really big deal. I will be keeping my eyes very closely on what happens on January 25th, the day that Microsoft will be releasing earnings. And so hopefully they will drop us some numbers then. And if you want to be updated about what information they do share when they drop that, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.